Chapter 7. Mental Illness and the Problem of Intentionality. I cannot help myself at all, for he the demon uses my limbs and organs, my neck, my tongue, and my lungs. The Malleus Maleficarum. Although we regard some human actions as obviously intentional and some bodily movements as clearly unintentional, the meaning of the terms intentional and unintentional is often vague and uncertain, open to different interpretations. This terminological opacity is characteristic of our entire vocabulary for describing and explaining human behavior. It applies also to words such as deliberate, voluntary, and conscious, and their antonyms, and it reflects our pervasive ambivalence about human existence. Is life an opportunity or a burden? A sunlit arena where we exercise choice and shape outcome? Or a dark dungeon where we must plod as the slaves of superior forces? Intentionality, a classic psychiatric conundrum. The psychiatric enterprise has long been bedeviled by trying to answer the seemingly reasonable question, did Jones intend to do what he did? This problem was further complicated when the psychoanalysts arrived on the scene and demanded to know, did Jones consciously intend to do what he did? In this chapter 1 shall try to show that, except when bodily movements are demonstrably the results of neuromuscular discharges, we use the terms intentional and unintentional to praise or blame an actor rather than to simply describe or explain his behavior. Before undertaking a systematic inquiry into the relations between the ideas of insanity and intentionality, I shall sketch 4 brief vignettes to better illustrate the problem. Some typical cases of intending and non-intending. 1. Smith is developing a slowly growing malignant tumor in his left motor cortex. After complaining of headaches and visual problems for several weeks, he suffers a grand mal seizure while having dinner with his wife in a restaurant. Subsequent diagnostic studies and a neurosurgical operation confirm the diagnosis. Knowing this, it would be absurd to say that Smith decided to throw a fit. This is an obvious and uninteresting sense in which we can say that Smith's seizure was unintended or involuntary. 2. Smith is invited to join an office party celebrating the birthday of a fellow worker. The person in charge of the dinner arrangement at the restaurant asks him whether he wants steak or chicken, but Smith, explaining that he is a strict vegetarian, requests a special meal of plain spaghetti and a salad. Knowing this, it would be absurd to say that Smith did not really want to order a meat-free dinner. This is an obvious and uninteresting sense in which we could say that Smith's choice was intentional. Actions or happenings that fall between these two poles are open to interpretation concerning whether or not the actor acted intentionally. Here are 2 typical examples. 3. Harry is in love with Harriet and marries her. The union proves to be disastrously unhappy for him. He consults a psychoanalyst hoping to understand how or why this happened to him. After many weeks or months or years or decades of therapy, the analyst writes a scientific paper in which he explains that when Harry married Harriet, he unconsciously chose a woman who reminded him of his mother, who had dominated him and made him unhappy. The gist of the analyst's interpretation is that Harry did not really intend to marry a woman who was like his mother, but that his unconscious repetition compulsion made him do so. This is an essentially theoretical example of choice categorized as unintended happening. 4. Betty feels powerfully attracted to Bill, a handsome athlete much admired by her female friends. She marries Bill, only to discover that he is a bully who enjoys humiliating and beating her. After enduring the role of a battered wife for several years, Betty waits till Bill is soundly asleep one night, pours gasoline on the bed, and sets it on fire. Betty comes to trial, pleads not guilty by reason of insanity, and is promptly acquitted. This is a supremely practical example of choice, categorized as unintended happening. Caprice and confusion concerning intentionally. The ways in which people, especially members of the legal and psychiatric professions, actually use the yoked-together ideas of intentional mentally healthy, non-intentional mentally ill, illustrate their conceptual character and practical importance. For example, the trade in illegal drugs, like any trade, involves 2 parties, buyer and seller. Psychiatrists insist, and lawyers and legislators agree, that one of these parties, the buyer, is sick because his behavior is not intentional, the result of an illness called substance abuse disorder, and that the other party, the seller, is not sick because his behavior, called pushing drugs, is a deliberate, voluntary act. While this distinction makes sense as social strategy, see Chapter 9, it is patently absurd as an ostensibly phenomenological, scientific discrimination between what is and is not intentional behavior. After all, many persons who sell illegal drugs also use them. Do they have two personalities, one habitually selling drugs being bad, the other habitually using drugs being ill? Actually, the distinction the law and psychiatry now make between the practice of selling and using illegal drugs is reminiscent of the distinction the law made not so long ago about bootlegging, liquor, and prostitution. The man who sold whiskey and the woman who sold her sexual services were considered to be criminals. The people who bought these goods and services were not. Although the ideas of sanity and intentionality, insanity and unintentionality are often coupled, this seemingly necessary correlation need not always apply. Actually, several mental illnesses are described by the psychiatric nosologists themselves as consummately intentional behaviors. For example, in DSM-3, elective mutism is described as the continuous refusal to speak in almost all social situations. The refusal to speak is not, however, due to a language insufficiency or another mental disorder. Another disease, called oppositional disorder, is described as a pattern of disobedient, negativistic, and provocative opposition to authority figures. The disorder generally causes more distress to those around him or her than to the person himself or herself. In short, although these acts are viewed as intentional, they are nevertheless categorized as mental diseases. A similar relationship exists between intentionality and insanity in connection with certain dramatically violent acts, which typically prompt the response, "Only an insane person would do such a thing." Examples abound in the daily press. In August 1985, person or persons unknown set fire to a New York subway car used by derelicts as a home. Luckily, no one was killed, but 117 persons were injured and traffic was disrupted for a day. Mayor Edward Koch promptly declared that anyone who would start this intentionally is a deranged person. Mr. Koch thus offered the conventional definition of an arsonist, a person who deliberately sets a fire, as if it were the definition of a pyromaniac, a person who, strictly speaking, does not set a fire, but where, according to the DSM-3, fire setting results from a failure to resist an impulse, emphasis added. But if a person who sets a fire unintentionally is deranged, as psychiatric textbooks tell us, and if a person who sets a fire intentionally is also deranged, as Mr. Koch tells us, then we would have to believe that all fires are set by deranged persons, a conclusion characteristic of the reasoning of our psychiatrically enlightened intellectual elite. Is there a way out of this psychiatric semantic morass? Or must we throw up our hands and conclude that the ideas of intentionality and non-intentionality are invoked to serve precisely the purpose Mr. Koch's pseudo-explanation served, namely, to satisfy the hunger for an explanation of disturbing behavior? When a dramatic incident threatens people's sense of security, any explanation, no matter how nonsensical, is felt to be better than none. Scapegoats fulfill this function. In the past, a Jew or a communist did it. Now, a mentally ill person, or even mental illness, does it. Although I believe that this scapegoat model often adequately accounts for the meaning and function of mental illness explanations, there is a subtlety and strength to the idea of intentional, unintentional, and its relation to the idea of sanity, insanity, that is worth exploring further. I shall do so by examining the psychiatric perspective on art, the human activity now paradigmatic of our notion of intentionality. Art and insanity. Because art is much older than psychiatry, artists have had a big jump on insanity. Indeed, artists, especially poets and writers, have always shown a good deal of interest in madness. As soon as psychiatry appeared on the scene, psychiatrists returned the compliment by showing a keen interest in art. Before long, it became a truism that there is a close, albeit mysterious connection between madness and art. The mad artist, like the mad genius, may be a creation of the human imagination. Nevertheless, The figure of the insane artist, like the idea of insanity itself, now seems very real to most people. Although no one can define madness, most people believe that they can tell a madman, especially a mad artist, when they see one. And while people usually disagree vehemently about who is a mad artist, one person's madness is another person's sanity, and vice versa. Virtually everyone believes that some artists are mad and some madmen are artists. One person will thus nominate Vaslav Nijinsky as an example, another Vincent van Gogh, and still another Ezra Pound, while each is likely to proclaim the sanity of the other nominees. Although I do not think this is a very satisfactory state of affairs, most people view the examples I have cited, and others like them, as irrefutable evidence of the reality and validity of the construct called the mad artist. If we peer behind the mystifying and mysterious facade of the mad artist, we quickly discover an interesting connection between art and insanity. This connection pivots around the fundamental idea of intentionality, art being viewed as quintessentially intentional, and insanity as quintessentially non-intentional. How did this peculiarly polarized view develop? Why is it nonsensical to say that an artist is not responsible for the music he composed or performed, or the painter for the portrait he painted, or that the madman is responsible for his delusions or compulsions, or for killing himself or his wife? The answers to these questions reveal an essential aspect of what we now in the 20th century mean by the concept of mental illness. Alt and divine madness. As anyone familiar with the history of ideas knows, ancient thinkers entertained quite a different view of the relationship between art and insanity. This is largely because the philosophers of antiquity, for example, Plato and Aristotle, used the word madness to mean not an illness, but an illumination. Madness enhances rather than diminishes a person's dignity and stature as a human being. This is why Plato and Aristotle assert, perhaps take for granted would be more accurate, that poets are mad, that they must be mad in order to write good poetry. In Phaedrus, Plato writes, "There is a third form of possession, or madness, of which the muses are the source. This seizes a tender, virgin soul and stimulates it to rapt, passionate expression, especially in lyric poetry. But if any man comes to the gates of poetry without the madness of the muses, persuaded that skill alone will make him a good poet, then shall he and his works of sanity with him be brought to naught by the poetry of madness, and behold, their place is nowhere to be found." Clearly, Plato would have recoiled at the idea that the poet is ill, in our contemporary sense of the word, and therefore not responsible for the work he creates. Instead, what he meant was similar to what we now mean when we say that an artist must possess genius in order to be creative. This interpretation is supported by Plato's assertion in the Laws. "'Tis an old story, which we poets are always telling with the universal approval of the rest of the world, that when a poet takes his seat on the muse's tripod, his judgment takes leave of him." Aristotle's views were similar. According to Abraham Heschel's interesting study of Old Testament prophets, Aristotle takes for granted that the poet is afflicted with madness, that he is a manikos. The Greek word for prophecy, mantik, Heschel adds, and the word for madness, manike, were really the same, and the letter T is only an insertion. The same sort of idea was expressed by Roman philosophers. "There is no great genius without a touch of madness," asserts Seneca. "No man can be a great poet who is not on fire with passion and inspired by something like frenzy," declares Cicero. Thus, in Greek and Roman times, the artist, epitomized by the poet, was someone inspired by mysterious powers, a process attributed to and called frenzy, mania, or madness. None of this, to repeat, meant that the artist was not responsible for his behavior. It meant only that the philosophers of antiquity were acutely aware of what is obvious to anyone familiar with creativity, namely, that there is a sense in which the creative person feels or is passive vis-a-vis his urge to create. This sense of passivity, variously characterized as helplessness, inspiration, an irresistible vision or urge, is characteristic of the mental state not only of the inspired artist, but also of the person heeding what he considers a divine calling, or the man and woman in love. Modern artists, too, have emphasized their passivity vis-a-vis what seem like alien powers. They're having to give in to inspiration. much as ancient seers had to give in to prophetic visions. "I have written this little work," remarks Goethe about the sorrows of Werther, almost unconsciously, like a sleepwalker. He then adds this remarkable comment: "No productiveness of the highest kind, no remarkable discovery, no great thought which bears fruit and has results, is in the power of anyone. Man must consider them as unexpected gifts from above, as pure children of God. The process savors of the demonic element, which irresistibly does with a man what it pleases, and to which he surrenders himself unconsciously while believing that he is acting on his own impulses." Goethe's imagery and idiom bridge the gap between the old idea of divine madness and the new ideas of artistic inspiration and unconscious motivation. I must add a note of caution here about the ease with which the element of passivity in artistic creativity may be exaggerated. Although the experience of artistic inspiration may be passive and involuntary, translating it into a work of art, into a social product, so to speak, requires action and will. For example, Beethoven or Mozart might have heard beautiful music in their own heads, but they had to play it before others could hear it, and they had to write it down before others could play it. Again, there are important similarities here between artistic inspiration and mental symptom. Each is a private, inner experience over which the subject does not exercise direct, voluntary control. But action based on or driven by such an experience requires coordinated control of the musculature as well as choice of audience, placing the action squarely within the sphere of voluntary behavior. Action and intention. As philosophers have always emphasized, what distinguishes us as human beings from other living things is that we act. The idea of the person as moral agent thus presupposes and includes the idea of intentionally. But what exactly does it mean to assert that we act? It means realizing that our life is inherently, inexorably social. We act in the double sense that we behave and perform. To be isolated, Hannah Arendt emphasizes, is to be deprived of the capacity to act. Arendt, however, overstates the case. The socially isolated individual, for example, the shipwrecked person, or the social outcast, is deprived of his ability to act only in the sense that he has no opportunity to perform before an audience. He is not deprived of his ability to act in the sense that he retains his capacity to engage in coordinated, goal-directed behavior. Even here, a caveat is necessary. We become, in part, what we do. Accordingly, although a person may have no direct control over certain experiences, he may have indirect control over them. It is unlikely that Mozart would have heard the divine music that made him famous had he never been exposed as a child to music and to playing a musical instrument, and had he not practiced the craft. People who take up smoking cigarettes train themselves, in a manner of speaking, to crave smoking. Mutatis mutandis, I believe that people also train themselves, and/or are trained by others, to have experiences we call mental symptoms and mental illness. The point is that, in an important sense, everything we do is an act, a performance before others, as well as ourselves. To be fully human, a person must thus possess both the capacity to act and the opportunity to perform before an audience that legitimizes him as capable of acting and worthy of attention. Accordingly, a person can lose or be deprived of his humanity in two basically different but complementary ways: by lacking or losing the capacity to act in the sense of ability, which is why children, the very old and the very sick, are often not considered to be fully human, or by lacking or being deprived of the opportunity to act in the sense of performing on the stage of life, which is why the mentally ill are often not considered to be fully human. Moreover, this is why the powerless children, unemployed youth, mental patients are forced either to abandon their performing selves or to resort to dramatic antisocial acts, usually classified as crime or mental illness, to assert them. Art, intentionality, and psychiatry. Viewed as performances by moral agents, both art and madness come down to the words and deeds of persons designated as artists or madmen. How else would we know that a person is an artist if not for his artistic acts, or that a person is mad if not for his mad acts? Clearly, there can be no artist without artistic acts, no madman without mad acts. From this admittedly circular definition, we can quickly move to examining the words and deeds called art and madness. Following Susan Langer, I propose to view art as a non-discursive or presentational form of self-expression or communication. The term presentational is intended to convey the idea that in contrast to, say, mathematical symbols that represent their reference, presentational forms, such as a photograph or painting, literally present their meaning. As Langer puts it, visual forms are not discursive. They do not present their constituents successively but simultaneously, so the relations determining a visual structure are grasped in one act of vision. This is why artistic symbols or works of art, such as music, painting, or sculpture, cannot be translated into language. Their sense or meaning is bound to the forms in which they are expressed. In short, art is not, and cannot be, true or false. Instead, it is expressive or inexpressive, and it succeeds or fails in proportion as it is or is not expressive. Furthermore, by definition, art is the result of deliberate effort on the part of an artist. Webster's defines art as the power of performing certain actions, espene as acquired by experience, study, or observation, and it offers skill and dexterity as synonyms. In short, art is something a person does. It is engaging in an activity that yields a product, called a work of art. Hence, calling a work of art intentional art would be a tautology, whereas the phrase unintentional art would be an oxymoron. Michelangelo chipping away at a block of marble, trying to make it look like his vision of the prophet Moses, is the quintessence of a man intending to do something. That the result is also very beautiful must not distract us from an important point, namely that there may be beauty with or without intention, that there may be art with or without beauty, but that there can be no art without intention. We recognize that beauty is only a part, perhaps a relatively small part, of what we judge to be art when we contemplate the countless natural phenomena we consider to be beautiful but would not regard as works of art. For example, a dramatic sunset or an intricately shaped piece of driftwood. Why is such an object not art? Because it lacks the essential element of art, namely, human intentionality. These considerations bring us back to madness. By definition, insanity, psychosis, is an illness or the result of an illness, annulling the so-called patient's capacity to exercise intent. Hence, calling an insane act an unintentional insane act would be a tautology, and the phrase intentional insane act would be an oxymoron. As against a Michelangelo sculpting a block of marble, a John Hinckley Jr. shooting President Reagan is officially, that is, the quintessence of a man displaying the unintended symptoms of a disease called schizophrenia. That we judge such an act to be legally non-punishable is an integral part of this image. The social impact of art and insanity. Let us now distinguish between a work of art as an object, say a piece of music or a painting, and its effect on the audience, that is, whether it pleases or displeases. Then let us do the same with madness, distinguishing between insanity as a performance on the stage of life and its effect on others, that is, whether it pleases or displeases the patient's family, psychiatrists, society. What do we find? We find that the artist does not claim that his work is beautiful or insist that it should move us in some definite way. For example, Michelangelo did not claim that Moses looked like his statue. I emphasize the artist's fundamental non-coerciveness, his offering us a vision instead of attempting to impose one, because I believe it is an essential element of art, and in our unhesitating acceptance of it as the product of the artist's will. The madman presents us with the opposite reality. The so-called psychotic person is considered to be crazy not only because of what he does as a physical event, but also because of his own interpretation of why he does it. For example, the typical madman, who is now a stock figure on the evening TV news and on the front pages of the newspapers, is a person who dramatically kills someone and offers an unacceptable explanation for his deed. Hinckley not only shot President Reagan, but also explained that he did it to impress Jodie Foster. Note that such an ostensibly mad actor treats himself as a moral agent, responsible for his actions. He frames his explanations in terms of motives. However, we so abhor his goal and consider his motives so absurd that we refuse to grant them the logical status of a goal or a motive. Thus, we invalidate the actor as a non-agent, the mere object upon which certain causal forces have impinged. What exactly do we find so abhorrent? Clearly, not the deed itself. We understand murder in the family if the motive is money. We accept the murder of a prominent person if the motive is political. What we do not accept is the insane criminal's double offense, his adding the insult of his conceited explanation to the injury of his coercive act. This combination of shocking crime and bizarre explanation makes us feel profoundly violated. Our impulse, therefore, is to get rid not only of the actor, but also of his act. Killing the criminal accomplishes only the first goal. His deed remains, and its meaning may even be intensified by his martyrdom. This is why modern society has developed a more effective method of protecting itself from such injury, namely, declaring the actor insane and locking him up in a madhouse. Herein, then, lies the value of invalidating the other as insane. We protect ourselves not only from being injured physically by restraining him, but also from being injured spiritually by labeling his intentions as non-intentional mental symptoms. Art is of special interest in the spectrum of human activities because we experience it not only as perfectly intentional, but also as ideally engaging. Art neither imposes itself upon us, as religion often does, nor does it leave us completely on our own, as pure science typically does. Art affects us, but only with our cooperation and consent. To be sure, since art is persuasive, it may be employed in ways of which we disapprove, but we must not confuse persuasion with coercion. The similarity between art and addictive drugs clarifies this point. Each can tempt or seduce us, but each is powerless to affect us unless we actively seek and engage it. Madness, on the other hand, is often or typically coercive. Indeed, the principal power and threat of madness lies in its coerciveness, hence the counter-coercion of psychiatry. In short, art and insanity are like the positive and negative images of a photograph. What appears dark, intentional in one, appears light, non-intentional in the other. Our image of the artist, qua artist, is that of a person brimming over with intentionality. His artistic product is the embodiment of self-disciplined, self-intended self-expression. Hence, we readily equate the artist with his work. For example, we can look at a canvas by Renoir and say, "This is a Renoir," as if the picture were a veritable clone of its master. In contrast, our image of the madman, qua madman, is that of a person crippled by impaired or absent intentionality. His insane act is the very embodiment of undisciplined, unintended non-self-expression. Hence, we insist on severing the connection between the mentally deranged doer and his deed. For example, we speak of a misbehaving mentally ill person as not himself, as if his insane self were completely different from and unrelated to his real or normal self. Actually, these contrasting Jekyll and Hyde images of artist and madman have little to do with facts. Instead, they have to do with our desire and need to describe the most important feature of being human, the fact that we act according to degrees of intentionality. However, the person who truly cannot act because he lacks or has lost intentionality is not the madman, but the man who is unconscious or paralyzed. In other words, our customary distinction between artist and madman does not identify two different kinds of human beings, one of whom acts and the other does not. Instead, it identifies two different kinds of ascriptions to actors and their acts, ascriptions disguised as explanations of behavior and justifications for social policy. Freud's interpretation of art. To put this subject in wider perspective, let us now briefly review Freud's views on this topic. For better or worse, his ideas have shaped not only much of 20th century psychiatry, but also much of modern art criticism. Freud was interested in famous artists because they were famous, not because they were artists. That the artist, like everyone else, was neurotic was something Freud took for granted, although he pretended that he had discovered this from the artist's motivation for creating works of art. His condescending attitude and outright hostility toward great artists is evident in all his writings touching on art, but is perhaps nowhere more obvious than in his following remarks about Leonardo da Vinci. The great Leonardo remained like a child for the whole of his life in more than one way. The slowness which had all along been conspicuous in Leonardo's work is seen to be a symptom of this inhibition. It was this, too, which determined the fate of the Last Supper, a fate that was not undeserved. Actually, Freud acknowledged that he was not interested in art for art's sake. that he was interested in art only as a sign or symptom, pointing to something that he considered to be more interesting and important than art itself. That is, the hidden secret of the artistic product, as Freud always called art. And this, of course, could only be discovered by means of the psychoanalytic method. Furthermore, Freud justifies his analysis of art by postulating a problem where, in fact, there is none. For example, in the paper cited above, he asserts that while different lovers of art say different things about why they admire the Moses of Michelangelo, none of them says anything that solves the problem for the unpretending admirer, emphasis added. What problem? Note how Freud first plants a secret on the corpse, and then, after an elaborately staged psychoanalytic dissection, triumphantly finds it. In my opinion, what grips us so powerfully can only be the artist's intention. But why should the artist's intention not be capable, zero, being communicated and comprehended in words, like any other fact of mental life? Perhaps where great works of art are concerned, this would never be possible without the application of psychoanalysis. The product itself, after all, must admit of such an analysis. To discover the artist's intention, I must first find out the meaning and content of what is represented in his work. I must, in other words, be able to interpret it, emphasis added. What Freud here calls analyzing art and interpreting it is, in fact, deforming art into non-art and hence destroying it. I say this because by asserting that the artist's real intention is not embodied in his product, but must be revealed by translating its content into the jargon of psychoanalysis, Freud in effect annihilates the legitimacy of presentational forms. Indeed, there is a close similarity between the psychoanalytic invalidation of art qua presentational form and the psychoanalytic invalidation of abnormal behavior qua intentional action. As abnormal behavior is not really behavior, but an incomplete, symptomatic expression of experience, so art is not really art, but an incomplete nonverbal expression of experience. Each needs to be completed by psychoanalysis, a method that forces them to give up their secrets. Freud goes further still. He not only robs art precisely of that quality that makes it art, namely, its specially executed presentational form of self-expression and communication, but also actively demeans it by treating art as if it were like madness. Let us consider, Freud writes, Shakespeare's masterpiece, Hamlet. It was not until the material of the tragedy had been traced back by psychoanalysis to the Oedipus theme that the mystery of its effect was at last explained. This, it seems to me, says more about Freud than about Hamlet. I must add here that Freud never tired of emphasizing that the analyst-analysin relationship is that of superior authority vis-a-vis inferior subject, a view consistent with the verbal imagery embodied in psychoanalytic terminology. The analyst interprets, while the patient, who disagrees, resists. Compare and contrast this with the relationship between artist and lover of art. A lover of art is free to dislike Dali or Pound or Bartók without being branded resistant to the artistic pleasure these masters offer. Considerations such as these point to an exquisite connection between the aesthetic form of a work of art and its inherently politically non-invasive, non-coercive frame, from which it cannot be severed. Music is music only if you want to listen to it. If you do not, it is noise, even if it is Beethoven's Fifth or Mozart's Jupiter. Everyone would agree. But that is not the way we view therapy for mental illness. We consider it to be therapy, regardless of whether or not the patient consents to or participates in the enterprise. Intentionality, crime, and jurisprudence. The psychoanalytic perspective on human behavior has exerted a profound influence not only on artists and art critics, but also, indeed especially, on lawyers and jurists. The result has been a veritable tragicomedy, requiring the talents of a Voltaire to do it satirical justice. The story of Judge David Baselin's absurd experiments with psychiatry in the courtrooms of the District of Columbia has been told by others, and I will pass by it in almost complete silence. Instead, I shall briefly cite and comment on the views of James Marshall, another prominent legal scholar. They exemplify what happens when a gullible lawyer drinks too deeply from the poisoned psychoanalytic chalice. Psychoanalysis and the Modum Jurist. Marshall devotes an entire book, significantly titled Intention in Law and Society, to argue that, in view of the evidence brought to bear on the subject of crime by psychoanalysis, criminals rarely, if ever, commit crimes intentionally. The book, warmly endorsed by the late Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, delivers a remarkable message, as the following quotations illustrate. How valid are our legal assumptions about intention and motivation concerning what we know of the unconscious? Asks Marshall. His question is rhetorical. As he sees it, our assumptions are entirely invalid. Not surprisingly, he finds the criminal not responsible for his criminality, and finds society responsible for making the criminal a criminal. Perhaps more than most writers on this subject, Marshall actually seems to believe the nonsense he spouts, especially the view that our unconscious is like a gun in our own back. What a man purposes when in the clutches of his unconscious gives him no more freedom of choice of action than if he were disarmed before another man with a loaded gun. Unfortunately for this argument, the unconscious is only an abstraction or metaphor, which Marshall here equates, quite literally, with the power that a hold-up man with a gun wields over his victim in order to invoke the classic legal excuse of duress. Although such coercion properly exempts the coerced person from legal responsibility for his criminal acts carried out at the behest of his coercer, it is worth noting that existentially, even in this situation, the actor has free will and choice. He can choose to submit to the man with a gun and carry out his orders, or defy him and risk being killed. The famous post-war Nazi excuse that "I was only following orders," odious though it may be, must be recognized as belonging to the same genus of excuses. Marshall acknowledges none of this. Freedom of choice, he asserts without qualification, is not present when action is dictated principally by unconscious drives. How one knows whether an action is or is not so dictated, he does not tell us. He is satisfied with the conclusion that habitual or repetitive acts are a sure sign that the actor is acting unintentionally. Evidently, Marshall has never heard of habits, but he has certainly heard of illness, individual and collective. The influence of a sick culture can have the psychological effect of depriving the people of choice. I have cited Marshall's views on intentionality because they are typical of those of contemporary intellectuals regarded as having a progressive and psychiatrically enlightened attitude toward crime. One of the results of this attitude is that those who subscribe to it tend to hold the criminal increasingly less responsible for his criminality, and the victims increasingly more responsible for, somehow, coercing the victimizer to become a victim of his own criminal career. Writ large, James Burnham rightly saw in this posture the suicide of the West. Perhaps that fate indeed awaits us. The suicide of the criminal law seems to be upon us already, as the following development suggests. Negating intentionality, the suicide of the criminal law. The idea that insanity negates intentionality is now being carried to its absurd but logical conclusion by American psychiatrists and lawyers, namely, that we may define any act, even the seemingly most deliberate, as involuntary, simply by defining the actor as insane. People have always known that a human being, in the process of growing up in a family and society, acquires a conscience, that is, a sense of consciousness of the moral goodness or blameworthiness of his own conduct, intentions, or character, together with a feeling of obligation to do right or be good. Webster's. Because of the presence of this internal voice in all of us, people have been familiar with the fact, and have never found it very surprising, that the individual who commits a serious crime often feels a compulsion or need to confess it. Some of the greatest works of Western literature deal with this theme. The entrance of the psychiatric ideologue on the scene of modern history has changed this. He has managed to transform the compulsion to confess into a symptom of mental illness, negating intentionality. As a result, should defense counsel claim that the accused was mentally ill when he confessed, the confession may be deemed inadmissible as evidence. I have not made this up. Precisely such a scenario was reported recently in the New York Times. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear a prosecutor's appeal suppressing the confession of a murder defendant as involuntary because he was mentally ill. The man had approached a police officer on the street in Denver and said he wanted to confess a homicide. The policeman told him of his rights to remain silent and to have a lawyer present. The man said he understood and proceeded to confess the killing of a 14-year-old girl and to lead police to the scene and to other evidence, emphasis added. It would be difficult to imagine what other evidence one would need to conclude that this man knew what he was doing. After all, it is not as if he had confessed to a murder and was unable to provide evidence of his guilt except his confession. How, then, did someone get the idea that this man was mad rather than a murderer? Obviously, the killer did not want to talk to a psychiatrist. Had he wanted to, he could have sought one out, just as he had sought out a policeman. No doubt, as it is now customary in murder cases in the United States, the authorities arranged for him to be seen by a psychiatrist. Sure enough, the killer told the psychiatrists exactly what they expected to hear in such a case. God's voice had told him to confess. How psychiatrists, lawyers, and judges know that the defendant used the phrase God's voice literally rather than as a metaphor for his conscience, the report in the Times does not say. So much for Raskolnikov. While it may be sad that Dostoevsky has been rendered irrelevant by the march of psychiatric science, it is reassuring to realize that Raskolnikov was innocent after all. The rediscovery of intentionality. Actually, in this century, two different armies have tried, in the name of science, to destroy the same enemy, namely, the supposedly superstitious belief in free will. One, associated mainly with Sigmund Freud's name, is psychiatry and psychoanalysis. The other, associated mainly with B.F. Skinner's name, is behavioral psychology. Both of these deterministic systems have come under attack by certain psychologists and psychiatrists who, for the lack of a better term, may be grouped together under the name of will psychologists. Who are they? The best-known ones are Carl Jung, Ludwig Binswanger, the later, Otto Rank, Erich Fromm, Abraham Maslow, Rollo May, and Ronald Lang. Marching under banners variously called humanistic psychology, third force, or existential psychiatry psychology, these reactionaries against behavioral scientism agree on one thing only, namely that intentionality is an essential feature of the human condition, even of the condition of individuals said to be insane. Free will and the new psychology. Obviously, one need not be a researcher or scientist to discover that people have free will. However, once the proposition that there is no free will becomes officially accepted as the correct scientific view, legitimized by the research of accredited experts, the counter-opinion of lay people ceases to carry much weight. Henceforth, the opinion makers of society pay attention only to other, equally reputable scientists who, preferably on the basis of their own so-called research, come to conflicting conclusions. Hence, the ever-changing fashions in psychiatric theories and therapies, somberly supported by self-seeking charlatans contradicting and superseding one another. Otto Rank's career exemplifies this process for most of his life. Rank was a devout Freudian preaching the gospel of psychic determinism. Then he discovered free will and for the last decade or so of his life became the high priest of intentionality. In New Pathways in Psychology, Colin Wilson popularizes this fallacy, citing contemporary psychiatrists, psychologists, and other experts to support the revolutionary discovery that human beings can exercise choice. The triviality of the will psychologist's doctrine is perhaps best illustrated by the following dichotomy. The determinists, as we have seen, yoke together the absence of intentionality with the idea of insanity and build their systems on that fiction. Whereas the will psychologists, embracing common sense, it must be said in their favor, yoke together the self-evident presence of intentionality in the behavior of a moral agent with the idea of sanity and build their system on that fatuity. While the determinists thus emphasize the powerlessness of will and dwell on the importance of mental illness, exemplified by stereotypy, the will psychologists emphasize the power of will and dwell on the importance of mental health, exemplified by creativity. What the representatives of neither group can or are willing to do is let go of the ideas of mental illness and mental health and the jungle growth of slogans they have generated. All the existential psychologists, writes Wilson, have one thing in common, an attempt to approach the problem of mental illness in a practical rather than a theoretical way. Exactly. Wilson completely misses the point that what these psychologists have in common with those with whom they ostensibly disagree is that they all believe in mental illness. All of them talk about mental illness, mental health, schizophrenia, and treatment. And all of them accept the legitimacy of the two paradigmatic psychiatric interventions, involuntary mental hospitalization and the insanity defense. The results are pathetic. For example, Wilson approvingly cites Maslow's having been struck by the thought that modern psychology is based on the study of sick people. But since there are more healthy people around than sick people, how can this psychology give a fair idea of the workings of the human mind? Nonsense. In the first place, according to the faithful Freudians, and Maslow always counted himself as one, virtually everyone is mentally ill. If so, the assertion that there are more mentally healthy than mentally sick people is false. Secondly, if the ideas and interventions of the psychopathologists are questionable or wrong, why accept, as the will psychologists do, the psychopathologists' criteria of mental health and mental illness? The answer is because the deterministic and anti-deterministic psychologists are like two ladies of the night working different sides of the same street. Indeed, several well-known psychotherapists have themselves worked both sides of it. Otto Rank, as I mentioned already, went from devout Freudian disciple to determined anti-Freudian psychologist. Wilhelm Reich, from inspired individual psychotherapist to mindless pseudo-biological charlatan. Ronald Lang, from anti-psychiatrist to anti-anti-psychiatrist. In the 1960s, Lang celebrated the superior intentionality of the schizophrenic. Now he celebrates my methods of treating schizophrenics. For good measure, he adds, to say that a locked ward functions as a prison for non-criminal transgressors is not to say it should not be so. This is not the fault of the psychiatrists, nor necessarily the fault of anyone. Lang's opportunistic self-reversal has become so blatant that even sympathetic reviewers have begun to notice it. Lang became an anti-Langian, nervously separating from left-wing politics, drugs, mysticism, attacks on the family, even anti-psychiatry. As I have tried to show, Lang is merely the most recent of a long series of psychiatrists advancing diametrically contradictory claims consistently sensationalized as new discoveries. Finally, although Wilson makes passing references to intentionality and choice, he casts his own views in the traditional vocabulary of psychiatry. Schizophrenia, he writes, is a disorder in which the robot takes over from the I. So much for a critique of mental illness. The healthy mind, Wilson then explains, needs newness, otherness. Note that Wilson places newness and otherness, not healthy or mind, between quotation marks. So much for distinguishing between literal and metaphorical diseases. Revealingly, Wilson, like many of the experts he admires, speaks approvingly of psychiatric coercions and closed institutions. He refers to the remarkable Synanon experiment, says that the Synanon visit led Maslow to express again his feeling that modern society is sick, and explains that the reason that insulin or electric shock treatment often works is that it forces the T to make a painful effort and starts the flow of vital energy. Wilson concludes with what he calls a sketch of my own general phenomenology of mental health. Clearly, there are no significant differences between the positions of the psychiatric psychological theorists who support the reality of free will and intentionality and of those who oppose it. Intentionality and theology. Educated people today are convinced that the dichotomous view of intentionality I have just reviewed, and which forms so important a part of our contemporary notions of sanity and insanity, rests on and reflects the recent discoveries of researchers into the mysteries of human behavior. Of course, psychiatrists and lawyers encourage this delusion, but it happens that, once again, we do not have far to look for the prescientific origin of this belief. Before the Enlightenment, when people were comfortable with the idea of an essentially personal deity, they thought of him as their maker, who exercised perfect control over all his creations. Not a sparrow could fall from a rooftop without God having intended it, was a favorite maxim of the theologians. These experts, who devoted their lives to the study of God, developed the same dichotomous images of intentionality that we now attribute to artist and madman, respectively. In the religious version of this theory, Those who understood and obeyed God's will the most perfectly, the saints, were viewed as possessing virtually perfect intentionality, acting completely on their own free will, whereas those who succumbed to the devil and fell under his power, persons possessed by demons, were viewed as completely lacking in intentionality, behaving like automatons without any will of their own. This explains why people went to such desperate measures in an effort to exorcise the victims of that terrible affliction. Plus, QA change. Intentionality and the idea of being human. I have tried to demonstrate the similarities between our modern ideas concerning art and insanity by showing that they represent the two poles or boundaries of our concept of what it means to be human. We view the artist as so rich in intentionality as to be superhuman, and the madman as so poor in intentionality as to be subhuman. Our crediting the artist with an overabundance of intentionality, and hence humanity, needs no further comment or illustration here. Nor does our crediting the madman with an absence of intentionality and our consequent discrediting of him as a human being. There is, of course, nothing new about denying the humanity of the other. Much of history is but a footnote to it. Nor is there anything new about affirming and reaffirming the essential humanity of the other, even when doing so requires our painfully empathetic identification with him. Terence, ca. 995 to 159 BC, is credited with having articulated one of the earliest and most succinct formulations of this view. Homo sum, humani nil a me alienum puto. I am human. I regard nothing human as foreign to me. This declaration became the credo of the European Enlightenment. The credo of modern psychiatry is thus an inversion of Terence's. Nothing human is alien to me became nothing alien is human to me. The alienated person was thus both seen and defined as a person lacking in intentionality, an image that, in turn, gave rise to the birth of the alienist or mad doctor, later called psychiatrist, who was both seen and defined as an expert on alienation and the keeper of alienated persons. The earliest British cases involving the defense of insanity center on this very issue. For example, in 1812, in the trial of John Bellingham for the murder of Spencer Perceval, First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer, James Mansfield, Lord Chief Justice of the Commons Pleas, instructed the jury as follows. In another part of the prisoner's defense, it was attempted to be proved that, at the time of the commission of the crime, he was insane. With respect to this, the law was extremely clear. If a man were deprived of all power of reasoning, so as not to be able to distinguish whether it was right or wrong to commit the most wicked transaction, he could certainly not do an act against the law. Such a man, so destitute of all power of judgment, could have no intention at all, emphasis added. Clearly, this cannot be so. A person capable of committing a crime must be able to have some intention, for example, to load his weapon, aim it, wait to fire it until the moment he thinks is right, and so forth. My point can be made more simply, though less elegantly. Among our most basic intentional acts are urinating and defecating. A person who does not wet and soil himself, that is, who demonstrates sufficient control to urinate and defecate in appropriate places, demonstrates, by so acting, that he can and does have intention, at least for delaying or initiating these bodily evacuations. Obviously, a person totally lacking the capacity to form intention could not do these things. Clearly, however, a physically disabled person lacking the capacity to control certain bodily functions by no means necessarily lacks the intention to control them. Considerations such as these suggest, of course, that the lack of intentionality of the insane, like insanity itself, is a legal fiction, see Chapter 11. In any case, the fiction or fact, depending on the observer's opinion, of a person incapable of intending is a threat to society, much as a grain of sand is to an oyster. To protect itself, the oyster surrounds the sand with a substance we call a pearl. Similarly, to protect itself, society surrounds the idea of lack of intentionality with the idea we call insanity. As a pearl is not sand, so an insane person is not a person. Johann Christian Heinroth, 1773-1843, one of the founders of modern psychiatry, put it this way. Individuals in this condition, mentally diseased, exist no longer in the human domain, which is the domain of freedom. Rather than resembling animals, which are led by a wholesome instinct, they resemble machines. But if some persons are viewed as subhuman, others, perforce, will be seen as superhuman. They are the artists who are so rich in intentionality that their mental makeup, according to Freud, defies psychiatric analysis. Finally, still others will be viewed as possessing a combination of these conflicting characteristics. They are the mad artists, whose pathological genius forms a subject especially dear to the hearts of psychiatrists. While this perspective has helped the psychiatrist to stand with one foot planted in medicine and another in the humanities, it has, in my opinion, harmed both medicine and the humanities. Oil and water do not mix. They are better used separately than combined in an unstable, homogenized mixture. Claiming to decipher and dignify insanity, psychiatrists have instead deformed it. If they have failed to deform art as well, it has not been for lack of trying, but rather because they have been unable to gain the same kind of legal and rhetorical control over art as they long ago gained, and still exercise, over insanity.